Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this Euractiv debate. Today, we're going to be talking all about batteries and can sustainable batteries in Europe be globally competitive? We'll be talking about that today. Now, welcome to all of you tuning in live today. You can interact with us despite the fact that you're not in the room with us. We have our hashtag here, hashtag EA Debates. Please do tweet along with us. And you can also ask questions through our online platform. We'll be starting that shortly. You can get them all in there, upvote them, downvote the ones you don't think are relevant, and we'll talk about them near the end of the event. Now, so what are we going to be talking about today? The European Commission is reviewing the legislation that underpins the battery industry in Europe. It's going to try and make it more green, make it more applicable to our ambitious climate and transport and mobility targets. But it needs to change because it's universally accepted that it's outdated. So how should it be reviewed? Well, we have several distinguished guests with us today who are going to help us get through that issue. And here they are on screen with us, and I'll introduce them now. First up, we have Mattia Pellegrini, who is Head of Unit Waste Management and Secondary Materials at DG Environment at the European Commission. Welcome to you. Then we have Claudia Gamon, who is a member of the European Parliament, who sits on the Industry and Energy Committee. She sits with the Renew Europe group in the European Parliament. Then we have Mark Mistry, who is Public Policy Manager at the Nickel Institute, which is kindly supporting the event today. Next to him on the screen is Adam McCarthy, who is President of the Cobalt Institute. And then last but not least, we have Vasilios Rizos, who is Head of Sustainable Resources and Circular Economy. Now, where we are now, we will go into some short statements with the panelists who are going to give us their take and brief views on the issue today, and then we'll launch into the Q&A. So we're going to start with our first guest today, who is Mattia Pellegrini. Mattia, you have 1 or 2 minutes now to get us through your views on this subject.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. So, indeed, we are very close to the finish line. I mean, I will not say the finish line, because then we will have a lot of work to be done with the European Parliament and the Council. But as you know, in the Green Deal, it was clearly indicated that the batteries legislation will be reviewed. The deadline of October was indicated, and as you probably know, in the Commission work program has been indicated that it will be done in Q4 of 2020. So we're very close, not sure whether we will manage by October, but if it's not October, it will be November. So we are very busy on the final, let's say, amendments to the text. And let me explain what we need to amend. First of all, we need to change this legislation because it's a very old legislation. And as you know, we have many types of batteries now, from portable batteries down to industrial batteries. But more importantly, there is new categories of batteries which have emerged, such as, on the one side, electric vehicles batteries, but also light mobility batteries, so the ones we use on our e-bikes or e-scooters. So for all these reasons, we need to cover all these type of batteries. And the new batteries regulation, which this could be already first a big change, that we will move from a directive to a comprehensive regulation. And essentially, it will cover all type of batteries, as I said, from portable to industrial. And we will create specific categories of batteries. The second point I want to make is that it will be a very green legislation, but also a very important legislation in terms of internal market. And so far, we are still discussing with the legal service of the European Commission, but most probably the legal basis of this regulation will be internal market. So that will be important because it means that these rules which we are going to set will be applicable in all member states. And what we're talking about? First of all, we're talking about the sourcing of raw materials. So there will be, which are very important for especially electric vehicles batteries, there will be a set of rules which, in terms of due diligence of the raw materials which we are going to use in European batteries production. Secondly, there will be a number of what we call sustainability requirements, so a number of rules which will be applicable to place batteries into the market. Notably, I would like to recall a few of them. Some rules on carbon footprint for batteries, so which may be first an information obligation and then a threshold to place batteries in the European market. Second type of rules on the performance of the batteries, and third type of rules on the mandatory recycled content for certain elements which are contained in the batteries, notably some critical raw materials such as cobalt and lithium. So this will be all set of rules which will be there and will have to be respected if you want to place batteries into the European market. Then we will have, of course, rules in terms of recycling and recovery, efficiency, with rather ambitious targets, two sets of targets, most probably one for 2025 and one for 2030. But also we will have rules on second life. So as you know, a batteries, especially from electric vehicles, at the end of its life, it can either go directly to recycling or it can also be repurposed in order to be used for energy storage. The idea of this regulation will be that there will be a set of rules that needs to be respected in order to give to this battery a second life. So what we will set out what are the conditions for also second life. And finally, there will be, of course, also horizontal rules in terms of extended producer responsibility, in terms of setting up a register of batteries in each member state. So a number of obligations also in line with the other type of waste legislation. So that's, I think, is what is going to be the main components, what are going to be the main components of this legislation. Of course, I mean, if there are more interest on specific topics, we can discuss, but that's, I think, is the idea is to really cover the entire value chain of the life of a battery. So from the sourcing of the raw materials all the way down to the possible second life of a battery.
Many thanks, Mattia. That's a great introduction to how the Commission is looking at this issue. It's very complex, very broad, I think. Over to you now, Claudia. Maybe you could tell us sort of a taste of how the European Parliament is, what you'll be looking for from this legislation and so on. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm happy to be here. We at the European Parliament recently, early this summer, adopted an initiative report where I myself was the rapporteur on the topic of energy storage. And we looked into general regulatory barriers such as double taxation, double charging, 10E, PCI implementation, but we also looked into what can we do for proven technologies and also those that are further away from the market, what needs to change in the regulatory frameworks to really enhance for energy. Batteries, I think, will play a very important role in balancing the grid, but also providing larger storage capacities, starting from households to up to an industrial scale. Let's look at smart charging, for example. That's not really a topic of the future. It's already here. It's something that I would personally very much like to do with my own electric car, but I don't have the infrastructure here where I live. Now seeing with lithium-ion batteries as a state-of-the-art technology, we are facing a couple of challenges, such as a strong dependency on manufacturing in third countries. There are no proper recycling schemes in place in the EU. There are no guidelines for second use. And this brings me to the two or three most important points that I think need to be addressed in the reform of the batteries legislation. And Mr. Pellegrini has actually hinted at a couple of those that we also have in our report in the Parliament. First one would be introducing ambitious recycling targets for lithium-ion batteries and other emerging battery technologies, because we also need to think about technologies that we don't yet know and what we would do with technological change and improvements. We have to make use of raw materials that are already here in the EU and reduce our dependency on third country imports. I think this is a very important strategic political issue. And the second point would be defining guidelines for second use of these battery types, for example, as storage units in private households. And a crucial aspect that goes further than that goes beyond the Batteries Directive, but what was an important call in our initiative report is that we need to be able to compare the CO2 footprint of different where we really call on the Commission to provide us with the research that we need to provide us with an overview to get a comprehensive view of the CO2 life cycle analysis of different technologies, because right now we're always looking at very specific areas, and I don't think that this gives us the right information that we need. And
Claudia, we'll get more.
I'm really looking forward. Sorry, I'm really looking forward to the reform of the legislation. I think it's a very exciting time for energy policy nerds in the EU.
Fantastic. We'll get back into a few of those issues shortly. Mark, over to you now. Nickel is one of the main ingredients in most of our batteries at the moment. What do you think about what Matthias just said about this idea of capturing the whole value chain and so on? Over to you.
Yeah, many thanks. Good morning from my side. I think that I can agree with a number of points which were already made. So we as producers of nickel welcome the revision of the Batteries Directive. We also feel, as Matthias said, that there's a need to revise this piece of legislation, given that it is already 14 years old and we have new emerging technologies coming on the market. And we all know that batteries are touching upon a number of other priorities of the European Commission, be it climate change, energy transition, green mobility, circular economy. As nickel producers, we stand at the beginning of the value chain, but also at the end. So we provide the raw materials, but we also recycle them once they leave the use phase. And it is very impressive to see that many of our member companies are right now preparing themselves to actually have the capacities available in the coming 8 to 10 years when these batteries, which are currently put on the market, when the big amounts are actually coming back from the use phase, to actually recycle them and to keep them in Europe and to make them available for further life cycles. There are, however, a few conditions that our member companies require to actually invest into their European installations. And I would like to mention 4 today. The first one is long-term planning security. Metals production in general is very capital intensive, and it requires not only a lot of capital, but also a lot of time to actually have these investments paying out. So we are talking about life cycles, investment cycles of 10, 15 years. So for our companies, it is quite important that the framework, the regulatory framework which is set up, is consistent and is predictable. The second point is full life cycle thinking. We heard from Mr. Pellegrini that there's currently work ongoing looking into the battery carbon footprint. We, however, feel that it is important to also look into the use phase and to take the full picture into consideration and not to focus on, for example, batteries production only. The third point I would like to mention is coherence in the regulatory framework. We are not only a capital intensive industry, but we are also an industry which is very energy intensive. And we are also an industry which is dealing with hazardous substances. So it is important to also look into other areas of European legislation and to ensure that the framework is coherent and allows our companies to continue investing into their installations. And the last point is the international dimension. It's in the case of nickel, we are talking about significant amounts of nickel which are produced in Europe. So there's enough nickel in theory available, but still we are supplied with especially raw materials from abroad, with ores and concentrates or nickel intermediates. And this is going to continue over a very long time. So it is important to keep this international dimension in consideration. Thank you.
Many thanks, Mark. Over to you now, Adam. You're, I expect, in much the same boat as Mark in some ways, given that cobalt is, again, another main ingredient of many batteries. Is there anything that you sort of would add to what he's just said?
Yeah, I mean, I think we would even echo the Nickel Institute's comments quite closely, because as many of you may know, cobalt is a byproduct of both nickel and copper mining, and is very rarely actually found on its own and mined on its own. So we certainly echo a number of the points that Mark and the Nickel Institute were making. I would just like to pick up on a couple of comments that have already been made, I think, to reflect perhaps the pressure that is brought on cobalt. So if one looks at cobalt generally, we have two main points of pressure. One is around the chemicals management, but also then issues of responsible sourcing. I think we're all very well aware of certainly the reputation that cobalt has from a sourcing perspective. So we're very supportive of efforts to introduce greater use of due diligence, greater use of third-party auditing systems. What we would say to the point that Mr. Pellegrini mentioned earlier is that if we are going to move down towards the road of having due diligence systems put into legislation, our view is we would prefer to see this in the horizontal legislation that is being talked about by Commissioner Reinders, rather than in sectoral legislation under the batteries regulation, as it will be. Cobalt, as well as nickel, as well as other battery materials, certainly has other applications, other uses. So you're also sort of creating a false dichotomy if you do that with your responsible sourcing. The second point to make on responsible sourcing is the industry has already done a significant amount. There are numerous programs on the ground in producer countries such as the Democratic Republic of Congo in the case of cobalt, and there is a lot of work going on across the globe on due diligence standards, adherence to OECD guidelines. So therefore we would really like to see in the legislation, rather than a prescriptive approach, that the Commission would follow an approach similar to that in the conflict minerals regulation, where industry is allowed to apply ongoing industry standards, but ask for almost an equivalence decision from the Commission. Turning to the question of legislative coherence that Mark mentioned, this is something that we are in the middle of now from a cobalt perspective. As I mentioned earlier, chemicals management is a key challenge for cobalt. Cobalt is a carcinogen for some routes of exposure, and we are currently going through a process under the REACH regulation, a restriction process for some of the cobalt salts which are used in the production of battery precursors. And if this legislation goes through as currently written, we're not going to be having a battery value chain in Europe, because we're not going to be handling some of the critical raw materials we need. So what we would call for, and be very clear, we're not calling for no regulation here, but what we would like to see is the appropriate use of risk management tools that allows industry to contribute to the broader political agenda. One final point I'd make, and again echoing I think comments that have been made around recycling. I think we all support recycling. We all support the greater use of recycling in Europe. However, we certainly for cobalt, we are never going to have enough of the raw material to replace that primary supply. So we need to be making sure that we're not putting into place barriers to entry to the European market for raw materials, and we need to make sure that we do have that access to third country raw material. So
you've given me a great segue there, Adam, into Vasilios's 1 or 2 minute statement now with well, your sustainable resources and circular economy are your kind of areas of interest. I mean, what the Commission saying about an increased focus on recycling must be music to your ears, right? Or are there some things that we need to watch out for?
Yeah, kind of. Okay. Thank you for inviting me, first of all. So let me just start that I find the topic extremely interesting, because we shouldn't forget that it brings together very different agendas, such as decarbonization, mobility, circular economy, and competitiveness. So it's really a topic illustrating how different agendas connect with each other. So let me just start bring a few figures. That sales of electric cars reached 2.1 million globally in 2019, while only 10 years ago, about 17,000 electric cars were on the streets globally. Now, in 2019, according to figures by the International Energy Agency, sales in Europe increased by 44%, reaching 590,000 units. And of course, this increase was, we should keep in mind, it was largely driven by growth in countries like Germany and the Netherlands. Now, according to the estimates by the International Energy Agency, sales of electric vehicles could account for around 3% of global sales in 2020. Now, of course, these figures indicate that there is an ongoing transition, even though, of course, a mass market adoption of electric vehicles has not been achieved yet. But in the coming years, it is expected that there will be a tipping point for the penetration of electric vehicles in the market. And certainly at some point, especially looking into the commitments that many countries in Europe and beyond have made to phase out at some point internal combustion engine, at some point there will be a point where there will be more streets, more cars, electric vehicle cars in the streets than cars with electric vehicle with combustion engine. Now, there is an elephant in the room in this discussion. So in the coming decades, the coming years and decades, a very large number of batteries are expected to enter the market. And at some point, they will reach their end of life. And of course, they will need to be managed. And as mentioned earlier, these batteries, of course, contain material that combine high economic importance with supply risk, critical raw materials, in other words. And there is a strategy published by the European Commission recently, specifically on critical raw materials. So there is a key question for Europe on how we're going to manage these batteries. Now, at CEPS, we did a study a couple of years ago with the objective to just really provide an indication of the scale of the challenge, but also of the opportunities that could arise from this large market penetration of electric vehicle batteries. So using predictions at the time and data on expected EV sales in the coming years, which is of course just a prediction, average lifetime of electric vehicle batteries, volume and price of raw materials, we'll calculate that in 2030, by establishing in Europe a collection and recycling mechanism to collect 65% of these batteries and recycle them in Europe, we could recover cobalt, nickel, aluminum, and lithium with a value of 408 million. Now, if we could increase the level of ambition and assume an 85% collection and recycling rate of these batteries, this figure could be worth of 555 million. Now, moving 10 years later, 2030, with more batteries entering the market in the previous years and reaching at some point their end of life, these estimates could be much higher, and we calculated that by collecting and recycling 65% of batteries, we could recover around 1.1 billion value, cobalt, nickel, aluminum, and lithium worth of value. Another scenario of collecting 85% of these batteries, around 2.6 billion could be recovered. Materials with a value of 2.6 billion could be recovered. So these are, of course, just some estimates based on figures on the time. They are not predictions, but they provide an indication of the scale of the benefits that could be achieved if Europe is prepared and has the right regulatory framework for a large penetration of vehicles in the future. Now, large volumes will bring, of course, large challenges, but also opportunities. So we need the right framework conditions. The battery directive is under revision. I think this is already mentioned before. There are several elements that should be there, and I think they have already kind of announced. There needs to be rules for specific batteries, for different types of batteries. This is an old piece of legislation. And of course, there should be a place also for or rules for second life applications as well. I'm going to stop here.
Many thanks. Yeah. Many thanks, Vasilios. That's a great overview of the recycling end of things, and particularly the electrical vehicle aspects that are inherent in batteries. Just to everyone who's watching at home, we're opening up the Q&A now, so make sure that you start flooding your questions into the online platform, and we'll try and put as many of those as possible to our panelists later in the Q&A. Now, but to kick things off here, Mattia, I just wanted to ask you, Adam actually raised this point in that making and developing this battery industry ecosystem in Europe, is that going to be unlocked purely through the revision of this directive into a regulation, or is this just the first stage? How coherent, basically, is the Commission being on unlocking this battery world that we want to leap 2 feet into?
So I think batteries is seen actually as a model, because you were before this revision, very shortly, the European Commission has launched the European Batteries Alliance, which was indeed based on different pillars, and one of them was the legislative framework. Indeed, to be competitive and sustainable, you also need the right legislative framework, but as you may be aware, it was also based on funding this market so providing sufficient funding for batteries production in Europe. And indeed, through that funding, which was either European funding via the European Investment Bank or funding via the member states through state aids, there were two important state aid decisions which were taken. Via that support, but also via this announcement of this revision in order to create a stable legislative framework, we now have already a clear sign of the development of that market. Indeed, as some of the speakers mentioned, the changes in the market are really, even over these few months, the last few months that we have been extremely busy in preparing this legislative revision, we saw that in terms of looking at the numbers, even the expected number of gigafactories which are foreseen to be constructed in Europe is constantly increasing. I mean, when we started to work on the impact assessment, there was an estimation of 20 gigafactories, and now we are all the studies and all the reports that talk about at least 25 gigafactories in Europe. So Europe is really, in terms of investment, there has been an unprecedented investment in European batteries production. So indeed, Europe is really positioning itself as one of the leading batteries producers. Now, what we have to make sure is that we are one of the leading, if not, but also in a way. So the leadership will be done.
Thanks, Mattia. I mean, you mentioned the Battery Alliance, and maybe this is a good question for Mark and Adam. Have you noticed in your respective industries a real effect of this alliance yet? You know, this idea that we can sort of capture this entire value chain and dip into this 250 billion euro market eventually, or is it still a work in progress? I mean, at first it was referred to as the Airbus of batteries, and that's kind of been downplayed now. What are your takes on that? Maybe Mark first, you can give us your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think. Well, the European Batteries Alliance is only in place since roughly 2 years. And we noticed that in the first stages of the European Batteries Alliance, there was, of course, a very strong focus on battery manufacturers. And this was something that we also shared with the Commission a while ago, that we felt that there should be more emphasis on the industry, which is on the one side providing the raw materials to this industry, as well as the one who is at the end of the day recycling the mass of batteries when coming back. What we can see is that there's right now a step taken towards the raw materials industry. As some of you might know, yesterday there was the launch of the European Raw Materials Alliance, where we assume that it is going to work closely together with the European Batteries Alliance. So we feel that the right steps are taken. It is acknowledged that the effort to establish a full globally competitive batteries value chain in Europe requires that we focus on all parts of the value chain, not only batteries production, but also those providing the raw materials and those standing at the end of life and ensuring that the batteries are recycled at highest safety and environmental standards.
And yeah, same question then, Adam. What's your take on the Battery Alliance so far? Big improvement? Still work in progress?
I guess it's certainly progression. We've certainly seen it generate a lot of enthusiasm in Europe. What we are seeing when we talk to the cobalt industry is that there is a desire and a willingness to diversify end markets away from Asian markets to Europe, to North America, for example. We are not yet seeing significant shifts in demand and supply patterns. One barrier we do see for a lot of European users of cobalt is that there's still an unwillingness or an inability to commit to longer term contracts, such as the Asian downstream users can do, and that there's a number of reasons for that. Partly around sort of some of the downstream users have not yet really thought through their supply chain strategies. There is some questions of an ability to finance some of these longer term agreements. But we do see steady progress. And we're quite optimistic that, over the medium to long term, there will be a positive impact on the development of the battery value chain here, and therefore we will see more primary cobalt coming into Europe. So it's been a positive start, let's say.
And so Claudia, Mattia mentioned that the Commission's work will not be done when it's published. There's still a lot of work to be done with the Parliament and the Council. Do you already see the Parliament and the Commission being on largely the same page in terms of this revision, or are there some sort of diverging strands and philosophies going on here?
Well, from what I heard now from Mr. Pellegrini, I think we are very much on the same path. I don't know if we're on the same page, but those are questions of details. And I think we will start debating this once we have a text, obviously. But in general, I think we all acknowledge the potential that lies there and the potential that could be brought up if we provide the appropriate regulatory framework for these industries to develop in Europe. And I think what is important also for the Parliament is the question of the importance of having this industry, of having these capacities in Europe. That is one of the things that we talk about a lot, is the strategic importance of establishing the value chain in Europe. And I think what is important with batteries is there are things that we can change and there are things that we cannot change. We cannot change, for example, where cobalt comes from, but we can change a lot of things further along in the value chain. And I think we need to, that's my personal opinion, we need to concentrate on what we can reform and what we can change and what we can do to establish and support the industry in Europe.
In your opening statement, Claudia, you mentioned quite heavily the energy storage aspect of the battery industry, whereas Vasilios leaned more into the electric vehicle aspect of it. Do you think, Claudia, that there is a bit too much of a focus on the mobility aspect of this, that the potential of the renewable energy industry and batteries coming together is being not in the limelight as much as it should be? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, but I mean, people need to have, when I say people, I mean the general public, they need to have an example of where is this used. And I think it would be really hard to explain to the public how large batteries can be used on an industrial scale, but they might have one in their electric bicycle and they might have one in their electric car at some point, many of them. And that gives us the chance to bring this to really provide a forum for a public debate, and that brings the topic along, and then we can start bringing it further to energy storage. But I think what will also be interesting for the public is the combination, to have it as to have storage potential in your own home, when you have a photovoltaic on the roof of your house, and you can use also the battery in your car as storage in your own home. That will be once this is used in many households across the European Union, I think the debate will change.
Vasilios, just on the recycling aspect and the second life and this whole idea of reusing batteries. Recycling in other sectors obviously relies quite heavily on public awareness, public buy-in, this idea that, we're willing to recycle. Is that going to be true also of batteries as well? I mean, at the moment, in terms of mobile phones and things that we already use batteries quite heavily for, there's a bit of a gap there, right? So does a real step change need to be made in that aspect?
No, yeah. No, that's a good point. First of all, when a battery will reach at some point the end of life status, it's not necessarily that it will go immediately for recycling. So it is assumed there will be probably 3 different routes for these batteries. I mean, the worst option will be disposal. But I mean, I would say that, of course, we cannot really compare mobile phones with electric vehicle batteries. We studied both of them because, of course, electric batteries will have a much more significant size. They will also be they contain material of value, so it is unlikely that people will just dispose them. But it is a possibility. Now, recycling is, of course, a second option for these batteries, and the third option is reuse as energy stored and in order to provide energy storage services. Now, what will happen to these batteries exactly will depend, of course, on factors such as cost of recycling at the time, the price of and the value of materials within the batteries, and of course, on whether there will be a clear business case to reuse these batteries rather than just recycling them. In any case, policy should provide a legal framework that allows all of this, that has all of these different options on the table. Of course, not disposal, but it should provide a framework that enables both recycling, that keeps, let's say, the options open for both recycling and reuse as energy storage, in order to provide energy storage services.
That gives me probably a good segue. Thank you to everyone at home for your questions are flowing into the online platform already. There's one here from Natalie, which I think maybe Mattia, you could maybe give us some insight into. How will the EU revision of the directive ensure the sustainability of those other batteries, the AA batteries, the AAAs, the coin cell batteries? Are those going to be included in this, or is it a real focus on the big industrial versions?
No, indeed, as I mentioned, we're batteries. There is a lot of attention also to the small consumer batteries, the one we use all of us. You may be aware also that in the Circular Economy Action Plan and the Green Deal as well, there was a clear language in terms of possible restriction and prohibition of non-rechargeable portable batteries. We are going to look we are exploring that option, and we are finalizing, as I said, our proposal. Alternative to that option, another option could be to regulate the performance of these batteries. So to set standards at European level, according to which only portable batteries which fulfill certain standards could be placed into the market. Because according to our study, which we carried out, not always, although you may think as a consumer that is always the case, and actually the majority of the case is not the case, you may believe that the rechargeable portable batteries, so the ones you can recharge, are always better from an environmental point of view than single-use portable batteries, so the ones you only use one. This is not always the case. It depends on which type of applications. And more importantly, what we have seen is that in certain applications, the single-use portable batteries outperform, so they're much better in terms of performance than the non-rechargeable one. So that is some elements which we need to take into account. We know the political wish to restrict maybe some of these batteries from the market, from access to the market. At the same time, we're also discussing, as I said, the possibility to set some performance requirements. The beauty of a performance requirement will be that it will regulate both rechargeable and non-rechargeable, because there will be again a performance requirements which will phase out from the European market all the bad ones, so all the ones which are normally not performing good, neither from an environmental point of view, neither from an energy point of view. So this is so indeed it will be covered, and we are looking to both performance requirements and possible restrictions.
Just a question for you, Mark. On you mentioned the life cycle analysis aspect of the battery industry. I mean, we've seen so many sort of studies and headlines published over the last 12 months, 18 months or so, saying electric cars are greener than internal combustion cars, and also the flip side, depending on who's done the study. Do you see any sort of coherence in the battery industry about whether or not there should be this life cycle approach to establishing whether or not the industry is green or not? Or do you think that there's quite a lot of work left to be done?
Well, as we heard, as part of the review of the Batteries Directive, there are activities under preparation to work on calculating, on the one side, the battery's footprint, but we also heard that life cycle assessment is going to be a major tool being applied to give us answers. And Mr. Pellegrini just gave a very nice example where life cycle assessment helps us to take the right decision when it comes to the environmental dimension. And we might have cases where life cycle assessment might lead to results that we are surprised of. Like, for example, that it doesn't make any sense from an environmental perspective to phase out portable batteries in certain applications and to replace by rechargeable batteries. When it comes to life cycle assessment of EV batteries, there we feel that industry has a common understanding, and that we gain more and more knowledge about all the influencing parameters, and that we better understand that it's a complex system, that, for example, for the time being, it might be that in certain countries, in certain EU member states, where you have a lot of coal and lignite being used to produce electricity, an electric vehicle might not perform as good as, for example, a classical combustion engine car. But there, I think it is important to put things into a context and to see the long-term vision that the European Commission has in mind with, for example, a decarbonification of electricity. So to move towards cleaner electricity that we provide to the markets, as that will also ensure that electric vehicles outperform the classical technologies.
Thanks for that, Mark. Claudio, just picking up on your point from earlier about the political dimension of this, especially when it comes to imports into the European Union. Commissioner Maroš Šefčovič made a bit of a political point, I think last year, when he said that the Commission would not rule out banning dirty imports of batteries, for example. Is there a danger here that you get into something like a WTO dispute, or is there has to be a real sort of brave political decision made on the kind of things that the European Union is importing, especially when, as the Commission plan kind of says, we want to build up this industry ourselves?
Well, I have a problem with such statements, because this would say that he can guarantee that anything coming from the EU would in itself not be as dirty as any import that is coming in. But I think that's a hard statement to make. I think in general we should focus on evidence-based policy here. And I do have a feeling that sometimes, especially in this field, especially when it comes to the use of electric cars, sometimes it's more policy-based evidence that is being created. And that's how I strongly believe. I think the question is also, as I said before, a strategic question of, do we want to be dependent for an even longer amount of time? It is an important, just imagine having an entire industry in Europe being dependent on third country imports. That's not a sustainable way to do it. But if you want to ban anything, personally, I think it's really, it's always a bad idea to start the debate with banning anything if you don't have an alternative that is that has a sustainable business model in Europe. So we need to focus on strengthening the European industry, giving them a coherent regulatory framework, and also giving them the possibility to have a business case in building greener batteries here in Europe. That is the most important question. And then in the end, I think we will not be as reliant on imports. And that's the point for me.
Thanks, Claudia. Just turning over to another virtual question from Claude. Is there going to be any provision in the future legislation, this is probably for Mattia, to avoid the export of batteries that can no longer be used outside of the European Union, where presumably the legislation there will be less strict in terms of recycling and disposing of those batteries? Or is that an issue for another time?
Thank you very much. Indeed, it's an extremely good question, and it's something which we are reflecting in this final stage of development of the proposal. Before I move to that question, I just wanted to reply to the question about also the statement about one of our vice presidents in terms of protectionism. I think I'm just telling you what we're doing at technical level. At technical level, indeed, as some of the speakers have mentioned, there will be in this battery legislation as part of the sustainability requirement obligation in terms of first declaring the carbon footprint of the batteries, and then in a second stage to have a threshold, so to have a performance classes and to have a threshold below which you cannot sell batteries into the European market. When I say performance classes, I always like to, because I'm a rather practical person, and I think people have to understand what we have in mind, is the system that you have in the fridge under eco design. So as you know, in the fridge, you have all these nice A, double A, and A++, A+++. So you have a performance classes of your fridge. You can choose as a consumer. We will do a bit of the same for batteries, with also an additional step, which will be below that level of performance class, the battery will not be able to be sold on the market. And that will apply to all types of batteries. Now, if our European batteries are better performing from a sustainability point of view in terms of carbon footprint than the Chinese, for example, then of course this measure will be more applicable to Chinese imports. But this will depend on the carbon footprint of each of the individual batteries models. So that's and that type of measure, we believe that is fully let's say compliant with the WTO. We have even checked that with the legal service of the Commission. Now, moving into the export of batteries, indeed, this is a very good question, and it's something which we are reflecting at the moment, because on the one side, we want to facilitate, as I said, also second life of batteries for energy purposes, so for energy storage. But at the same time, we are aware that if these conditions to be met in order to have a second life of batteries could be manipulated in order to export that valuable material outside the European Union. So we know, so we are thinking about a system. I also want to say that based on my experience, and to put very strict rules on exports, if they're not properly designed, will not play the right game. Because, for example, on end-of-life vehicles, so automotive cars, which they come to the end of their life, we have very strict rules into the European Union. And you will be shocked to know that out of 10 million of cars, which they reach the end of their life every year, 4 million of them are unknown whereabouts. So that means that they disappear from the market. So I'm talking 4 million out of 10. So we have the example of end-of-life vehicles, so of cars at the end of their life, and we don't want the same is going to happen to batteries. So we are looking into that issue, and also we will try to tackle that issue with another revision which we are preparing very shortly, which is the revision of the waste shipment regulation, where we will set the rules to export the waste outside the European Union. So indeed, it's a very good question. It's something which is coming up as now really a very important topic towards the end of this proposal. Also some political pay attention. There may be a risk. Indeed, this will start with years. In one of the third countries, that's the low performing.
Maybe we could just took this question over to you now, Vasilios, because I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Europe has sort of a bad history of shipping our waste to other parts of the world that's willing to deal with it, ships, plastics, et cetera, et cetera. Is there a danger that the same could happen with batteries, despite the best intentions maybe of the European Commission?
Yeah, that's a good question. And, you know, of course, there's always a risk. I mean, I think it has already been, I think it was already mentioned that the Commission will look into this. Of course, having strict rules in place doesn't mean necessarily that this is something that's going to be implemented in practice. And there are rules for electronic devices, for example, for e-waste devices, for devices that have reached an e-waste status, but still e-waste, exports of e-waste is a major challenge in Europe. Now, of course, I think that gives a signal that we should act in advance and have the framework conditions in place that will prevent this in the coming decades, especially if we're talking about such a huge flow of batteries. Now, and that's the segue, I think, to another point I want to make. One of the key promising actions included in the critical raw material strategy published just a couple of weeks ago is really to draw a mapping of how we could potentially supply materials from existing EU stocks. And I think this is crucial because having a good understanding of what are the devices that are already exist in actual stocks can also help us understand or have a good picture of how much of the future material demands can be covered by existing stocks. And since you mentioned mobile phones, and some of these mobile phones, of course, are exported illegally or other e-waste devices outside the EU, we calculate, though, at first we calculate that there could be 700 million phones that are not exported but really sitting in our drawers. And this, of course, could provide a good source of secondary raw materials. Now, of course, this is unlikely that's going to happen with batteries because of their size and other and the value of materials included in the batteries. But still, we need a good understanding of what are the stocks and what are the, of course, the anticipated demands for these materials in Europe.
I mean, as you said, increased demand for batteries in Europe and the rest of the world obviously means that you need more people to obviously work in these sectors, more gigafactories, more raw materials production. Just a question for Adam and Mark, which Jan on the virtual platform has touched on. How is the increase in the battery industry's output going to affect the workforce in your various sectors? I mean, is there going to be real changes there? Are there things like automation that will be coming in? I mean, maybe there's a parallel between that and the fossil fuel industry, and that there will be big changes because of the way EU targets are changing and so on and so forth. Maybe you could give us a bit of that, Adam.
Interesting question. I mean, honestly, no, I don't think we will see changes per se in how industry is operating, how the large-scale industrial mines are actually sourcing the materials. We will certainly see changes, I think, certainly in the cobalt sector, around what is called the artisanal small-scale mining sector, which is around 20% of supply of cobalt from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And we will certainly see improvements there, both in terms of health and safety in the workplace. We will see improvements there in the access to market for that raw material. What I think we will certainly see is more mining projects being undertaken. We will certainly see a growth in the downstream, the handling of the material, the refining of the material, and ultimately the recycling of the material. And that obviously will lead to more workers being involved in the industry, more workers being exposed in the industry. And this really comes back to a point I think Mark and I made earlier, that if we want to be building that value chain in Europe, we need to be aware of the decisions we're making around chemicals and the potential impact they have to limit Europe's ability to grow that industry. So that's certainly something that I think we would highlight in this discussion, that we can have this ambition, but if we do not have this policy coherence, we're not going to have that industry.
What about you, Mark, in terms of, as Vasilios mentioned, the idea of growing the industry in Europe by pinpointing new resources? Does Europe have the workforce, the know-how, the skills to actually tap into that at the moment?
Well, we have to be aware that Europe is already not a major producer of nickel, but we have significant nickel production taking place. So if we talk about a global market of roughly a bit more than 2 million tons of nickel mine production, Europe accounts for roughly 10%, a bit more than 10% of it. And if you think about the amounts which are required in Europe for the batteries market, that would be sufficient. But of course, we have other end users of nickel, which then would suffer. I would like to agree with the points that Adam made. Maybe one addition on top of the comments from Adam, and that's, if you look into nickel production over the past 20, 30 years, we can see that our industry managed over the entire time to cope with a 3 to 4% annual growth in nickel demand. And therefore, we don't see from our side that we would run into any shortcomings. The critical point is, however, that all the growth has taken place outside the European Union. So if we talk about Europe, if we talk about European production, that remains stable over the past 10, 15, 20 years. Maybe if I have the opportunity, I would like to quickly comment on comments made by Vasilios regarding the transboundary movement of material I think it is important to also acknowledge that within the metals industry, recycling is a very complex system where we have companies which are highly specialized, and we see materials being shipped over several borders, sometimes within the European Union. And there, what Mr. Pellegrini said is very important. The waste shipment regulation and its review is going to be also critical for the Batteries Directive. But we also see these materials being shipped across the borders of the European Union into other OECD countries. And therefore, we feel that there is an existing regulatory framework with the European Waste Shipment Regulation, but also with the OECD legislation on the transboundary movement of waste, which helps us to ensure that the recycling is taking place under conditions which fulfill high environmental standards and the protection of workers. The critical point is, however, is recycling or the recycling, the backyard recycling that we can see taking place, for example, in countries like Nigeria.
Just a bit more on this idea of building this ecosystem. And Claudia, you mentioned this earlier about how you would like to be in a position where you can use your electric vehicle as a giant battery, feed the electricity back into the grid, buy it back when it's cheaper, this whole idea of being an energy prosumer. What needs to change for that to happen, aside from having the infrastructure to do it, of course? I mean, there's been the review of the electricity market rules lately. Are the pieces all there to sort of help batteries, again, tap into this ecosystem that is slowly being built?
Well, I guess in terms of technology, it's already there, but I believe that we can do a little bit more to really support the business case for these uses. What is the problem for energy storage in general in most countries is the topic of double taxation and double charges. And that makes it really hard to provide not just competitive prices, but to have a sustainable business model in the storage sector. But in general, I personally believe we don't need to overregulate everything in this regard. For example, there were some inputs in the beginning of our process saying that we would need to provide a definition of energy storage in order for it to work. I don't agree with that. I believe that there are some things that we can specifically leave out for interpretation. We don't need to overregulate everything. I think things are there. There are now 2 initiatives in Germany and in Austria in terms of their renewables legislation, where in Austria they try to provide a legislative framework for energy communities, where either be it in an industrial park or many houses together as a community would want to build an energy community where they are all prosumers and have a different infrastructure that they share amongst each other. I think that's a good start. I would very much like to go away from this word prosumer. It's very Brussels.
My apologies. It's I've tried to de-jargon everything as much as possible, but some still slips in. I mean, just going over to you, Vasilios, on this issue of building this ecosystem where people can really, normal people can really sort of buy into this. Do you see this happening anytime soon?
You mean if you see like if I see a large scale application of second life applications, basically?
Indeed. Yes.
Okay. Well, what I can say is that there will be different challenges and different factors will play a role in this. So first of all, the cost of producing new batteries will play a key role, because in order to use second life applications, there needs to be a price benefit for second life applications. Now, the more batteries we will have in the market and the more technology will evolve, it is likely that this cost differentiation might decrease, and that might add some challenges for second life applications. Now, a second key issue we should keep in mind that's related to eco-design is that the batteries are primarily designed in order to be a good fit for a particular electric vehicle, not necessarily in order to provide energy storage services. And that means that refurbishing later the device, it might be actually a complex task. So that's something that perhaps could be taken into account with eco-design measures. Now, also, I think it was already mentioned earlier that there are not at this stage many standards for second life applications, standards that will actually ensure the quality of this application. So I would say that I cannot really predict how extensive the second life applications will be, or how often people will be using them, but these are three key challenges that could be addressed by, let's say, a new regulatory framework.
And just over to you then, Mattia, this idea of setting standards for end of use, second life. Presumably this will be included in the review, but how do you actually set these standards? Is this something the Commission is producing purely by itself, or is it something that you're taking advice from other people?
So first of all, let me say that the second life, indeed, we believe that there is a market for it. I mean, there are various studies. Some people, they say it could be up to 30%, if not more, of the batteries which will be placed into the market. So 30% of the batteries which are coming to the end of their life, they may be then repurposed for energy storage. So the way we're doing that is a two-step approach. First one, we are going to define in the current, in the new batteries regulation, what are the key conditions to be met. So for example, that there should be a clear demonstrated second life for that battery, that there should be a contract in place, that all the relevant environmental legislation has to be complied with. So we will set out a number of conditions that under which you can then do, if you meet that conditions, if you comply with them, then you can do second life. The most important decision, which is under discussion at the moment, is which seems a very let's say tiny decision, which indeed is maybe tiny but will have massive implication, is what is the status of a battery after the first life. So you have an electric vehicle's batteries which is used in a car, it comes to the end of their life. Then you have two options. You could say that these batteries, it is waste, and then it can have a second life if it meets certain condition, or you could say it is not waste if it meets certain conditions for the second life. Of course, that they're going to choose at the end in the regulation will have massive implication, because if you say it's not waste, then you will facilitate second life, because in terms of requirements will be much easier. If you say it is waste unless it meets a number of conditions, but then you define that at the end of the first life it is waste, then all the relevant rules about moving waste will apply. So then there will be clearly the cost linked to it will be much higher. So that is really what we are trying to decide. After the first life, the conditions will be the same under which you can do second life, but then you need to define if it's more, and what has led to even a more complicated discussion, which we are having at the moment, is that if you say, it is not waste, so you want to favor second life, then you have an issue with export, because then it's not waste, then it will be rather easy to move. So then if you make it easy to move, you may see an increase of export of batteries after their first life. So it is a rather complex issue. We are still discussing with also our political masters what would be the best option in terms of defining waste or not waste. I mean, the conditions, as I said, that's it. Then once you have the key conditions, then we will do secondary legislation to define the details of that. I don't want to scare anybody. I'm actually the first person to scare me, because I have a very limited amount of people to work on batteries. But what we have as calculated at the moment is more than 35 pieces of secondary legislation which will come out of this batteries legislation. So that's gives you an idea. I mean, for some of you, I mean, especially representative of the parliament, which they are familiar with the SUP directive, so the single-use plastic directive, which I also have the pleasure to implement in my unit. In the SUP directive, we had 8 of them. So it gives you an idea of what is coming up in terms of, so actually the legislation as such, which we will decide together with Parliament and Council, will only be the first steps, because then for any of these requirements I'm talking about, carbon footprint. For carbon footprint, we will have to have a delegated act which define what are the criteria to measure the carbon footprint of a battery. Recycled content. We will have to have a dedicated actor to measure what is the recycled content of a battery. So indeed, there will be an enormous amount of work which will keep us busy over at least the next 2, 3, 4 years.
Could you give us a clue on immediate timeline, Mattia? When will the revision of the directive probably be published and ready for us to have a look at?
Let's put it, let's say at the latest, that will be November, mid of November. So that's this is the envisaged timeline, and I mean, we are, as I said, at the last changes prior to the launching of the inter-service consultation. As you know, we need to consult all the different services of the Commission. And then after that, we will go to the political level for final validation and adoption by the College of Commissioners. But indeed,
just in time for Christmas. Just to pick up on a point you made earlier, Adam, about how the cobalt industry and other parts of the sector have made progress in recent years about cleaning up mining activities, processing examples. How much more can be sort of wringed from that process? Can it be improved exponentially, if you like? Are there new technologies coming in that will make, like you said, artisanal mining cleaner in other countries as well? Can you give us an idea about what the future sort of can promise?
I can certainly try. I mean, I think if you look at the cobalt supply today, around 80% of it is coming out of the large scale mining sector. Of that, around 65% is coming from the DRC. So there is still a significant portion of production that is coming from other parts of the world. So I think when we talk about the sourcing and the responsible sourcing of cobalt, we need to bear that in mind. That and if we look at the large scale sector, you can see over the last 20, 30, 40 years, continuous improvement in terms of the conditions on site, the conditions in the facility, the technology that's being used. It is becoming less labor intensive over time, and I think those trends will certainly continue. If we look at the small scale, the artisanal sector, which is a particular problem for the DRC and is can be 15-20% of supply. There is significant scope for improvement there. There is significant scope for improvements in the health and safety of some of the conditions of some of the mines there. There is significant scope for ensuring that standards are actually being met. They're making sure that, for example, the use of child labour is no longer an issue. And there are significant ways to improve access to mainstream supply chains. Industry is doing a lot with the small scale sector. We are working, I think, particularly on the ground to make sure that we're putting into place the right standards. There's a lot of development now in terms of developing recognizable standards that we will go through an audit to make sure that the supply that is coming from that sector can be traceable, can be shown to be responsibly sourced. So there is potential, but particularly in the smaller scale sector, and the use of new technologies will certainly be helpful in that regard.
Thanks for that, Adam. We'll unfortunately have to start wrapping up now because of the time restraints that we are all subject to. I just get to give all of you an opportunity to sort of give us your final thoughts on this very broad and complex issue. Pity me having to write about it on a semi-regular basis. What do you see? Let's take a hypothetical example where the battery directive and regulation has been published, and as Mattia says, all of the work has been done. Where do you see the battery industry, particularly in Europe, be in say in 2030, when all of these climate targets come to a head, and we should be enjoying clean energy more than we do now? Let's start with you, Mattia. How do you see the fruits of your labor paying off over the next decade?
So if everything goes well, what we can imagine is that is a system where batteries production in Europe it is subject to, as I said, performance classes. So only certain batteries which they meet certain carbon footprint will be sold in the market, where a certain amount of some of the critical raw materials which are contained in batteries, like lithium, cobalt, and others, comes from recycled content obligations, and also a market indeed where under certain condition second life of this battery is possible for energy storage. And finally, also a system where collection rates is extremely high. So that's I didn't mention indeed until now we did not discuss collection rates, but our expectation in the way we have drafted the relevant article for collection rates, in particular for electric vehicles batteries, that there will be a collection rate essentially of 100%. I mean, we didn't write 100%, but with, in legal terms, we have put a no loss principle. So it should be a market where all the batteries, if they don't go for second life, then they are recycled at the end of their life. So that is a bit, and of course, the final point, I mean, a market where the raw materials which are contained in that batteries are subject to strong due diligence requirements in terms of the mines from where they're coming. Of course, as one of the speakers said, that the Commission will play the role of authorizing certain schemes, because these schemes for sustainable supply or due diligence of the raw materials are schemes which are based on OECD guidelines, but we will take then, we count on having only in the market raw materials which they come from sources which are sustainable. So that is a bit the way I see it. If it's all the different requirements will go in the right direction, let's put it like this.
Thanks, Mattia. Claudia, how does our big battery green future look to you?
I hope we will be leading in sustainable battery production, and also having those in heavy use across different sectors to complement our renewables industry, and to have it all happen within the circular economy. That would be hope for the future.
Thanks, Claudia. We lost you a bit there, but I think we got the gist. Mark, how about you?
It was very positive.
Well, I would agree. I would also say that hopefully by 2030 we manage to close the gap towards the batteries value chains, which are well established outside the European Union. What we hope is that our industry has the possibility to provide the raw materials on a continuous basis to the European batteries value chains. What we also hope is that in 10 years' time, once the new batteries regulation is in place, we have a better understanding of the real footprint that raw materials contribute to, for example, EV batteries, but also to other batteries, and that we also understand not only the impacts that raw materials come with, but also the benefits that they create during use and recycling. And last but not least, I think that hopefully the efforts that our industry is undertaking in investing into further recycling capacities will pay out, and that our industry is actually there to recycle the materials once they leave the use phase.
Thanks, Mark. Adam, how does it look to you?
I think I would share certainly my colleagues' optimism and hope. I think one area we would focus on is being realistic about our ability to not still have to source materials from other parts of the world. Whilst we will certainly increase recycling, whilst we will continue to see increases in recycling materials within Europe, we're still not going to have enough to really have 100% own supply. So we will need to take supply from other parts of the world, and we will need to ensure that supply is both sustainable, that is also secure. So I think that would be certainly something we would be looking to see. And I echo again, if we do not sort out our policy coherence, then there is a risk that we will regulate ourselves out of being able to have such a value chain.
Thanks, Adam. And Vasilios, a final thought. How does it look to you?
Okay. So how I would like to see the future, let's say the future mobility, I would say that first of all, we would need to have, I would like to see a healthy global market that is not concentrated. It doesn't depend only on a few countries. And Europe is certainly part of this value chain that we will be producing. Batteries will be importing and also exporting. So there will be a healthy market where Europe will have a role. Now, when it comes to recycling and collection, I mean, I would hope that all of the batteries in the future will be collected for a second life or recycling applications. And we would like to see even more energy efficient processes for recycling, because of course, we shouldn't forget that recycling is an energy intensive process. So technology should evolve and will evolve. And finally, I would just like to conclude that all of these predictions about the future, they shouldn't just involve a linear thinking, because it doesn't necessarily mean that the model that we have right now with the car ownership might be exactly the same in the future. We might have different models, different mobility solutions. So we can make predictions like people have been doing since a long time on mobility and transport, but things can also be different. But hopefully it will be more circular or fully circular.
Fantastic. Fully circular. Fantastic. Thanks, Vasilios. And thank you to all of you, actually. This is clearly a very complex, admittedly, but important issue, given all of our climate targets and green push that's clearly going on in Europe at the moment. Yeah, and it reminds me to say thank you to all of you who've tuned in. Continue following Euractiv, because we will undoubtedly continue to follow this issue in as in-depth as possible. Keep following EA debates for all the rest of the things that Euractiv is talking about. Thank you to Mattia, Claudia, Mark, Adam, Vasilios, and hopefully for the next event, we can actually see each other in person. Fingers crossed. And thanks to all of you at home. And we'll see you at the next Euractiv event. Thank you.